This conference is brought to you by CodeStack, React and React Native development experts.
My name is Zawadzki, and I hope my pronunciation is correct, as I'm actually French and work for BAM, which is a Paris-based mobile development agency. Today, I'm going to talk about TDD and React Native. So, you might be thinking different things about this topic already. You might be thinking, well, I don't know what TDD is, or I hate TDD, which is a fairly common thought actually, or I don't know how to apply it to React Native. So if you're thinking one of these, I hope there will be something for you in this talk. But first, I want to tell you another story. A story about something called Dr. Shotgun. A few months ago, the COVID vaccination was made available to anyone above 18 in France. To book a slot, you had to check regularly on some websites. Then when one slot was available, you had to click through the interface and pray that you were the fastest to get it. So, what did French developers do? They created a script so that they didn't have to check the website and they were going to be fastest anyway. One of the scripts was called Dr. Shotgun. So when that happened, I thought, well, as developers, maybe we have some kinds of superpowers, you know? Well, let's see how we do every day at work. Let's take, for example, a specimen of the React Native developers. Let's see what they do in their everyday work. First, we see them coding on their laptop. They look happy and very focused. Then, they open the simulator or install the app on their phone and they try the feature. And most of the time, it just does not work as expected. So, our developer, who has tremendous determination, is now going to make use of logs and breakpoints to try to understand what the heck is going on here. Then they rebuild, they rerun several times before everything works fine. Each of these iterations can cost 2 minutes or even more, so it's a rather painful process. And it's not the end of the story for our developer, as they have to write a non-regression test to prevent other developers, including themselves, from breaking the app in the future. So, it looks like we don't have much superpowers and we spend a lot of time clicking in real life. Okay, so I think now it's a good time to introduce my topic. I'm going to briefly explain what TDD is before going further, so we make sure we're all on the same page. TDD stands for Test-Driven Development. It's a development technique from extreme programming that can be described as 3 phases. First, when you want to add a feature, you have to write a failing test. It's going to be printed in red, so that's why we call it the red phase. Then, you write the code needed to make the test pass. That's the green phase. But you're doing it as quick as possible, and that's why you need a third phase, which is called the refactoring phase, where we clean the code before going on to the next feature. Okay, let's go back to our developer story and see what changes when they use TDD. So now, instead of writing the test at the end, when they've already been through a lot of pain, they write it first. And then they can iterate until the test works, which is usually much faster than using a device, because you get a much faster feedback. And finally, they check on the device, and this time it works most of the times. So, TDD sounds like a good idea, and you're probably thinking, well, that's in theory, right? Otherwise, everybody would be doing it. 2 years ago, I thought the same, and I wanted to be sure. So I challenged myself to do 100% TDD for 2 weeks. But I struggled at first a lot because I didn't know which tests to write before starting my feature. And to earn you some time, I'm going to show you how to do it. First, let me introduce the app we're working on. It's a Hacker News clone. Hacker News is a website that shows links of tech articles of interest. And I'm going to show you how to develop in TDD 2 features that are, I believe, quite representative of any React Native application. So first, we can see our application here. that you already have a list of top stories, which are ranked by a mysterious algorithm. And on top, I have a button that enables me to change between top and new stories, which are the newest stories. So right now, when I click on the button, its title changes, but that's all. And what we're going to do here is we're gonna fetch the new stories when we click on the button and display them. So let's have a look at the code before starting. What we have is a page component, which contains two states, one with the list of items and the other one with the type of stories, which is either top or new. Then we have a toggle stories type function that toggles between top and new the state of the stories type. And right now it's just used to get the title of the button, which is computed in a little function here. Then we have a use effect that's called at the beginning, at the first render of our component, and that gets the list of news items. Actually, it only gets the top stories. So what it does, it's defined here, it fetches the top stories, and it gets all the IDs of the top stories, and we set the news items to the first 20 IDs. And then we use a flat list in which we render our news list item, which is a component that we're going to see in a few seconds. And we just pass to this component the ID of the item. Now, in this component, what do we have? We have a state that we initialize to null that contains the item. And in a use effect, similarly to what we've done before, we get the item. So what this function does is that it fetches the item on the Hacker News API. It returns this it parses the JSON and sets the item. So this is the interface of the item, and you can see here we display some information. You can see here, for example, the title, the host name, a number of points, the author, and the number of comments. And we have a test file. And in this test file, what we have is one test in which we mock the top stories API and the items. So these functions, I made them myself, and what they do is that they actually use knock, which is a handy package for mocking API calls. So here we mock the top stories API and we return the list. And here for one item, we mock the API for the ID and we return a fake item in which we only change the title here. So in our test, we render the page and then we check that the two titles that we have passed as arguments to the mocks are displayed. Then we have a small test on the type switch that checks that the title changes. And finally, we have a snapshot to cover our back whenever we change some components, but we're going to go back to that later. Okay, so now what I want to do is to fetch new stories when I click on the button, and the new stories and not the top stories. So what I'm going to do, before pressing the button, I'm going to do a bit of setup here. I'm going to mock new stories. I need to create that function later. And what I'm going to do is that similarly to this one, I'll pass let's say two different IDs, and then I'm gonna mock these two items differently, so with a different title. So here I say some new story, and then another story called TDD is my best friend. Okay, so now when I click on the button, so it's going to be asynchronous, so I'm going to need a wait for from React Native testing library. And then I'm just going to check that those two titles are displayed on my application. Now for the mock new stories list, I'm going to copy and change slightly the mock top stories list with the new stories API, which is this one. Okay, So now I'm going to show here my tests are actually running. And we can see that it's hanging probably because it can't find the components we're looking for. Here, if we see, it was expected to see some new story, but it didn't receive anything. And that's what we expected. So we're done with the red phase, and now we're going to do the green phase. So let's go back to our component. And here, what I want to do is to call a new route and to set the items whenever the stories type changes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to simply pass the stories type to the use effect, pass it as an argument here to get news items. Okay, here I add it, and I'm going to already say that it's either top or new. Okay, and now I'm going to change here my URL. So in the green phase, I have to go as quick as possible. So I'm just going to here say end of URL, and if stories type equals top, then it's going to be top stories. Otherwise, it's going to be new stories. Okay, and now here I just change this so I can simply put here my end of URL. Okay, so I think that should do it. Here it's complaining because I don't know, maybe it's a bit slow. Oh no, here just made a mistake. Up, should be better. Okay, now it should be compiling. So let's check our tests. So as I'm recording, the tests are a bit slow, and now I see that I have a change in my snapshot, which is a good sign, and now it displays some new story, and TDD is my best friend in my final snapshot. That's actually what I expected, so I'm good. I'm going to update the snapshot, and now I'm going to check on the real app whether it's working or not. So I'm just going to refresh and see. So here I see my top stories, and if I click on show new stories, there's a bug. That's interesting because I didn't foresee that. That actually it says here undefined is not an object, get host from URL. So that's one of the cases where you can see that something is not working. But now I know that it's not my code that's supposed to fetch the items that's faulty, but rather it's something that I didn't see. That here I have a function that parses the host to display it, and sometimes the URL is not defined. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this URL can be undefined in my interface, and then I'm going to say, okay, if my URL is defined, I return this. Otherwise, I return an empty string. And now I refresh. Let's see what happens. I show my new stories. I see here this one, the third one, didn't have a URL, and that's why it was failing. So at this point, I'm going to be honest, I should have written a test for that. I could have actually written a test for this little function here, but as I have limited time, I didn't do that. I've skipped refactoring so we can focus on another example. Now that we've seen how to write tests for an API call, I'd like to show you how to do TDD when you want to add some design to your app. So let's say that when I click on one of the articles, I'd like it to open on Safari, And if I've clicked on it and I go back to my app, I'd like to see the title grayed out so I know which one I've already read. So, it's design stuff, and it's usually something that we think it's impossible to do in TDD. Well, of course, you could use visual regression tools. Maybe someone has presented some of them at the conference, but personally, I don't use them because it takes some time for this test to run, and there needs to be a lot of conditions for it to work. First, you have to have pixel perfect mockups, then you have to be aiming at pixel perfect, and the data on your design has to make sense. So if you want to use TDD with visual regression tools, you need to have a lot of conditions. Okay, but our goal is to be test-driven here. So here's how I apply a TDD mindset when designing components. The only tests I write that can catch a design bug are snapshot tests. I tend to use them very sparingly compared to a few years ago, as they are not very easy to debug or understand and they can break easily. Personally, I like to do one per page, as you can see here. I have a final snapshot at the end, so I know which page to check on my simulator when I change a component and I see the snapshot is broken. Now, I can't really write the snapshot before coding, right? But I can do two things to make the snapshot update actually much faster. First, I can check if there's already a snapshot in place, so I don't have to find out later how to mock my data and to update my test so that it is covered by the snapshot. Two, I can find out which existing snapshots are supposed to break, so that when I'm happy with my design, I can quickly update my snapshots and I know exactly which changes I am expecting. If there is a change in one of the snapshots that I did not anticipate, and right away I have to check if this page is still okay. So here it is not so much test-driven development in the sense of writing the test first, but TDD in the sense that you know exactly which output you're expecting from your tests, and you don't have much thinking to do after the feature is done. So, how are we going to do it? So I'm going to simulate that I'm clicking on my TDD is my best friend item. So I'm just going to add some context here. So say link press. Okay, so I'm going to rename this story and I'm going to simply get by text TDD is my best friend. Now, when I save this, I expect my test to still pass. So I'm just going to open up the terminal for a second. And now what I'm going to do while my tests are running, I'm going to simply change here. I'm going to add isRed boolean. Let's do a flag. isRed set isRed, which is going to be a use state of a boolean initialized to false. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is that on the onPress here, I'm going to set isRed to true. And then I'll change the style here of my component, of my title. So it's this one. So I'm going to change it here. So what I'm going to say is that if red is true, I'm going to add to this component color, so let's say blue, so that it's going to be more visible to you. Okay. Sorry, so it's not red, it's red. So I'm going to run my tests. And now what I expect are two things. So now I'm expecting that my snapshot for the first of the components that I've rendered displays an array here of the style, the previous style, and then false. And for the second one, it displays the previous style and the color blue. So let's have a look at how the snapshot is failing. And what it's saying is that, okay, I have one that turns from an object, one style turned from an object to an array to which I did the color blue, and the other one turned from an object to an array with false, which is what I expected. So now I can update the snapshot, I can refresh my app and check if everything works for real. So here's my app, and when I click on one of the links, the title turns blue. So I'd also like to show you how we can open the link in the browser, because I think it's interesting as well. So here, after I press the button, I'm going to expect linking, which is the React Native library that opens link, that open URL to have been called with, and now I'm going to pass it the URL of my item, which is actually the same for every item, but it's not really a problem. Okay, so now I save my tests, and now my tests are expected to fail. And here what I can do is I can, in my component, do linking dot open URL with the item dot URL. Okay, so now TypeScript is complaining that it can be undefined. So here I'm gonna just wrap it into an if condition. So obviously I should be writing a test for that, but unfortunately I don't have very much time for this demo. Okay, so let's just check if our tests have failed. So yeah, they failed because linking.openURL has not been called. And I'm gonna save this, change, and now I expect my test to pass. Okay, on another note, while I'm waiting for my tests, maybe you should add some accessibility hints here to see that your title has been read, because it's going to be nicer to your users. And actually, we wouldn't depend on snapshots. But for the example of adding some design, I thought it was kind of easy. If you like the demo and want to know more about it, I have written an article covering more cases, and I should be dropping the link in the YouTube chat section or on Twitter after the conference. I told you I started a 2 weeks TDD challenge, but I did not manage to do 100% TDD on the first day. So these are how I did it and how you can do it too. First, before going to TDD, you have to train at two things. The first one is to train at refactoring. It's a major part of TDD that's easy to overlook, and it's easy to mess it up too. There are a ton of books and websites about refactoring. My favorite ones are refactoring.guru and the Martin Fowler book. So check them out if you want to know more about it. Then you should also know how to use Jest and React Native testing library before starting TDD. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot to learn at once. Then, when you want to apply TDD, you should start by doing it where you have confidence in your test, where you already know how to test the feature. That way, in the win phase, if your test is still not passing, you're sure that it's not because of your test and it's a real bug. Otherwise, it's going to cost you a lot of time. Then, for every case where you don't feel confident about your testing, learn how to write the test afterwards, so you'll feel confident next time and you know how to write the test. And if you apply this, you get closer and closer to 100% TDD. And as I personally started to apply TDD more and more, I discovered it was bringing me more and a lot more than just faster delivery. The first thing I gained was a better knowledge of my testing tools, Jest and React Native testing library in particular. And as my tests were becoming more important, my tests files became first-class code to me. That means I was paying more attention on how I split them, and I started to write custom functions and extract some of them just for my tests. And as a consequence, they became easier to maintain and a lot simpler to write. And I also increased my test coverage. And by that, I mean I really increased the number of features that were covered by my tests. And finally, in many cases, I figured out that my initial architecture or technical solution was not good enough to write simple tests. And usually, by making more testable, it was actually easier to understand and change later the code. And that's what makes me think that TDD makes me have a better architecture. So, I hope I've changed a bit of your opinions. So if you didn't know what TDD was when you started this talk, I hope now you know what it is and you know how to get started. If you were a bit skeptical about TDD, I hope you may want to give it a try, or at least to discuss it with some colleagues, or you can discuss with me on Twitter if you like. And if you didn't know how to do it, I hope I've given you all the keys, or at least some of the keys, to get started. Thank you very much.